The reluctant assignment. Humans are unpredictable, dangerous, and fundamentally incompatible with civilized species. Admiral Thera Zax's voice resonated through the Solarian Military Academy's grand amphitheater, her four arms gesturing in perfect synchronization to emphasize her point. The gathered cadets, all bearing the distinctive iridescent scales and dual pupilled eyes of the Solarian race, watched with rapt attention. Their reproductive cycles are chaotic, their diplomacy is based on deception, and their military strategy lacks the elegant precision our species has perfected over millennia. She tapped a claw against the display pad, bringing up footage of human soldiers in combat. Note their reliance on brute force rather than tactical superiority. A young cadet in the third row raised a tentative hand. Admiral, if humans are so primitive, how have they managed to establish colonies across 3 sectors in less than 2 centuries? Thera's scales shifted from their professional blue-green to a slightly irritated purple at the edges. A legitimate question, but one that touched on her personal sore spot. Luck, she responded curtly, and a reproductive rate that borders on the obscene. Humans breed continuously, without proper seasons or cycles. They produce offspring at an alarming rate, which gives them certain numerical advantages. The cadets chittered nervously, their scale patterns reflecting mixtures of disgust and fascination. Exactly the reaction Thera wanted. Fear mixed with just enough curiosity to keep these future officers vigilant when dealing with the newest and most unpredictable members of the Galactic Council. As the lecture concluded and the young Solarians filed out, Admiral Calix slithered into the chamber, his ancient scales dulled with age, but his eyes sharp with intelligence. Impressive lecture, Admiral Zax. As always, his voice carried the gravelly tone of one who had served through 3 interstellar conflicts, though perhaps somewhat biased. Thera straightened her ceremonial collar. With respect, Admiral, I have more combat experience with humans than any other officer in the fleet. My assessments are based on empirical data. Indeed. Admiral Calix's mouth formed what passed for a smile among their kind, which is precisely why the High Command has selected you for this assignment. The data crystal he placed in her palm glowed with the unmistakable red of priority orders. Thera's secondary heart skipped a beat as she absorbed the information contained within. This must be a mistake, she whispered, her scales flushing a deep violet in distress. A diplomatic escort for a human delegation. Sir, my expertise is in tactical assessment and you're our foremost expert on human psychology, Calix interrupted smoothly. The Council believes your unique perspective will be valuable during these negotiations. Which Council member suggested this travesty? Thera demanded, her dorsal spines involuntarily stiffening in alarm. Ambassador Elena Torres specifically requested you. Admiral Calix looked entirely too pleased with himself. Apparently, your reputation precedes you. Thera fought to control her scale coloration. Ambassador Torres, the human female whose diplomatic efforts had brought 3 previously hostile species into the Galactic Council. The same human who had publicly disagreed with Thera's published paper on human aggression patterns. Your transport leaves in 5 hours, Admiral Calix continued, already gliding toward the exit. I suggest you pack light. I hear the human environmental preferences can be challenging for our kind. As the door hissed shut behind him, Thera allowed herself a moment of unprofessional outrage, her scales cycling through a full spectrum of emotional colors before settling on a resigned gray-blue. After 7 cycles of carefully studying humans from a safe distance, she was being thrown directly into their midst. And during her approaching biological cycle, no less. Absolutely perfect. The diplomatic vessel harmony smelled wrong. There was simply no other way to describe it. Thera's sensitive olfactory glands contracted painfully as she boarded, causing all 4 of her breathing apertures to flare in protest. Bless you, or whatever the equivalent is for your species, came a cheerful voice that Thera immediately classified as dangerously friendly. Ambassador Elena Torres was shorter than Thera had expected, with an olive complexion and dark hair pulled back in what humans called a ponytail. Her eyes were an unsettling shade of amber, seeming to catch the light with unusual intensity. "Admiral Zax reporting for duty," Thera said stiffly, deliberately keeping all four arms at her sides, rather than extending one for the bizarre human-touching ritual they called handshaking. The ambassador smiled, revealing those disconcertingly flat teeth the humans somehow didn't use for combat. "No need for formalities, Admiral. We'll be working closely together for the next several weeks. I've read all your papers on cross-species diplomacy. Fascinating perspectives." Thera's scales rippled with surprise. "You've read my academic work?" "Oh yes. Your analysis of scent-based communication barriers between oxygen and methane breathers was groundbreaking." Torres paused, her lips twitching slightly. "Though I did find your section on human mating rituals somewhat creative." Heat rushed to Thera's facial scales. By the void. Had this human actually read her early, flawed research? The material based primarily on intercepted human entertainment broadcasts before proper first contact. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't violate 16 diplomatic protocols, a loud crash from the cargo bay provided welcome distraction. "That would be Captain Reed with your equipment," Torres explained with a resigned sigh. "He's an excellent soldier but somewhat enthusiastic about helping." "A soldier?" Thera's defensive spines began to rise involuntarily. "I was told this was a diplomatic mission." Torres nodded. "It is, but given recent skirmishes with the Vexari Collective, the Council insisted we bring security. Captain Reed leads our protective detail." On cue, a tall human male emerged from the cargo bay, carrying what appeared to be Thera's personal storage container, as if it weighed nothing, which was impossible given that it contained her gravity compensators and environmental regulators. "Got it all sorted, Ambassador, though I'm not sure why anyone needs this many metal cylinders for a 2-week. He stopped abruptly upon noticing Thera. "Admiral Zax. Honor to meet you. Marcus Reed, Earth Defense Force." Thera blinked rapidly in confusion. The human wasn't what she expected. Based on her studies, military humans were supposed to be bulky, aggressive, and loud. This one was lean, moved with unexpected grace, and spoke with a calm, measured voice that somehow made her tertiary auditory canal vibrate pleasantly. "Those aren't decorative objects," she blurted out before she could stop herself. "They're gravitational stabilizers. Your ship's artificial gravity would compress my internal organs without them." Instead of being offended, Captain Reed laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement that created small creases around his eyes. "Well, that would put a damper on our mission, wouldn't it? I'll make sure they're properly secured in your quarters." For the first time in her career, Thera found herself momentarily speechless in the presence of a human. This was not according to protocol. Not at all. 3 Earth days into the journey, Thera was begrudgingly updating her field notes on humans, specifically on Captain Marcus Reed. "Computer, add observation 47B," she dictated as she paced her quarters. "Human military personnel appear capable of surprising restraint in social settings. Subject Reed has not once attempted to dominate conversation with breeding displays or physical intimidation, as previously documented in human males." The computer chirped acknowledgement as Thera collapsed onto her resting platform. The diplomatic negotiations were scheduled to begin in 2 standard days, and despite her best efforts, she was no closer to understanding Ambassador Torres' strategy. Worse, her biological cycle was approaching faster than anticipated, perhaps triggered by stress or the unfamiliar environment. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Admiral, it's Reed. The ambassador asked me to bring you these reports before our approach to the checkpoint." Thera quickly straightened her uniform and composed herself. "Enter." The door slid open, and Captain Reed stepped in holding a datapad. He immediately wrinkled his nose but quickly smoothed his expression. Thera felt her scales flush with embarrassment. Of course, Her pre-cycle pheromones would be detectable even to his limited human senses. "I can come back later if this is a bad time," he offered, keeping a respectful distance. "No, it's fine," she said curtly, extending one of her upper arms for the datapad. "I'm perfectly capable of maintaining professional decorum despite my current biological state." Reed handed her the device, careful not to make physical contact. "I never suggested otherwise, Admiral." There was a hint of something in his voice that should have irritated her but somehow didn't. His eyes lingered on her face a moment too long. "What is it?" she demanded. "Nothing. It's just your scales. They're changing color. It's quite remarkable." Thera instinctively reached to touch the scales along her neck, which she knew would be shifting from their normal blue to a deep iridescent purple, a display meant to attract potential mates. "How mortifying." "A simple biological response," she said stiffly. "Nothing for you to concern yourself with." Reed nodded but didn't immediately leave. Instead, he leaned against the wall, studying her with an intensity that made all four of her arms feel suddenly restless. "You know," he said casually, "when I was stationed on Proxima VI, I served alongside a squad of your people. They taught me a bit about Silurian physiology." Thera narrowed her eyes. "Did they now?" "Enough to know that what you're experiencing isn't easy. They had special chambers on the base, regulated atmosphere to help manage the symptoms." "We're not discussing this," Thera said sharply, but without the bite she intended. Reed straightened up. "Of course. My apologies, Admiral. I just wanted to say that if you need accommodations, you only have to ask. No explanation necessary." As he turned to leave, Thera felt a peculiar sensation in her secondary cardiac chamber. Not the usual contempt she harbored for humans, but something more complex. "Captain," she called out before she could stop herself. He paused at the doorway, looking back with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. "The observation deck, is it still restricted during third shift?" A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Not if you have a security escort. I happen to be on duty tonight. Perhaps I'll take a walk then." "For my health." "For your health," he agreed with a nod that conveyed understanding without pity, a distinction Thera hadn't expected any human capable of making. After he left, Thera sank back onto her resting platform, her thoughts in disarray. This wasn't according to any protocol she'd established for herself. This wasn't scientific observation. This was something dangerous, something she'd warned countless cadets against. This was attraction. The observation deck was mercifully empty when Thera arrived, except for Captain Reed, who stood silhouetted against the vast starfield. He didn't turn as she approached, yet somehow she knew he was aware of her presence. "You came," he said simply, still gazing outward. "I said I would," Thera replied, keeping her voice professional despite the strange flutter in her tertiary digestive sac. "I assume Ambassador Torres briefed you on the Proxima Station protocols." Reed turned then, his face half illuminated by starlight. "She did, but I'd rather hear your perspective. Your actual perspective, not the official one you're obligated to give." Thera snorted, a habit she'd picked up from too many diplomatic functions. "My, aren't we presumptuous? What makes you think there's a difference?" "Because," Reed said, stepping closer but still maintaining a respectful distance, "I've read every one of your published papers, Admiral, and I've read your military file. They don't match up. You've read my..." Thera's scales flashed with indignation. "That's classified information." Reed smiled slightly. "Ambassador Torres has high-level clearance and a tendency to leave data pads unlocked." Before Thera could respond with the reprimand such an admission deserved, the ship's alert system activated with a shrill wail. Red emergency lighting bathed the observation deck. "Proximity alert," the computer announced calmly. "Unknown vessels approaching at attack velocity. All personnel to battle stations." Reed's demeanor transformed instantly. The casual diplomat disappeared, replaced by a soldier with eyes suddenly hard and focused. He tapped his communication implant. Read to bridge. Status report. 3 Vexari raiders, came Torres's tense voice. They've disabled our primary shields. Engineering reports critical damage to the propulsion system. Thera's military training kicked in, temporarily overriding her biological distractions. The negotiations. This is a sabotage attempt. Reed nodded grimly. Or an assassination. Either way, the ship lurched violently, throwing them both against the viewport. Reed's arm shot out instinctively, catching Thera before her head connected with the reinforced glass. For a brief moment, they were pressed together, his surprisingly warm human body against her cooler Silurian frame. "We need to get to the emergency pods," he said, his voice now pitched low and urgent. "Ambassador Torres has diplomatic immunity implants. She'll be their primary target, but you." "I'm the secondary," Thera finished for him, her tactical mind racing. The Vexari would consider disrupting these peace talks worth the cost of attacking the Silurian admiral. Another explosion rocked the ship, and the lights flickered ominously. Reed's hand found hers, one of her lower ones, and squeezed briefly. "Stay close," he said, drawing his sidearm. "And try not to hold my inferior human tactics against me when I get us out of this alive." Despite everything, Thera felt her scales flash with amusement. "I'll consider updating my research." As they moved toward the exit, preparing to fight their way to the escape pods, Thera realized that in all her years of studying humans, she had overlooked their most dangerous quality. It wasn't their aggression or their unpredictability. It was their ability to make you care about them, against all logic and training. And as she followed Captain Marcus Reed into the chaos of a ship under attack, Admiral Thera Zax knew that her carefully constructed prejudices were crumbling, just when she needed them most. Enemies to allies. The corridors of the Harmony had transformed from the pristine pathways of a diplomatic vessel into a chaotic battleground. Emergency lighting cast everything in a pulsing red glow as Thera and Captain Reed navigated the damaged ship. "Ambassador Torres, this is Reed." He spoke into his comm unit, keeping his body positioned between Thera and the direction of potential threats. "What's your location?" Static crackled before Torres's voice came through, broken but audible. "Secure, engineering section. 3 security personnel, holding position." "We need to reach them," Thera said, her military training overriding her discomfort at the proximity to the human. "If the Vexari boarding parties capture the ambassador, this peace conference is finished before it begins." Reed nodded, his expression grim. 2 decks down, but the main lifts are disabled. He gestured toward a maintenance access point. "Service tunnels. Not comfortable, but they'll get us there." As Reed pried open the panel, Thera felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, the beginning of her biological cycle intensifying under stress. Her scales shifted involuntarily to a vibrant mating display of purples and blues. Mortifying, but unavoidable. Reed glanced at her, concern evident in his expression. "Your condition. Will you be able to manage?" "I am a Silurian admiral." Thera snapped, her pride stung. "We don't allow biology to interfere with duty." A small smile played at the corner of Reed's mouth. "Humans have a similar saying about mind over matter." "After you, Admiral." The maintenance tunnel was narrow and poorly lit, designed for maintenance drones rather than biological entities. Thera's 4 arms made navigation awkward, but she refused to show any sign of difficulty as she crawled forward, acutely aware of the human behind her. 3 vessels, Reed said quietly as they moved. "Vexari raiders don't usually travel in packs that small. Their tactical doctrine calls for overwhelming force." Thera paused, surprised by his knowledge. "You've studied Vexari military protocols." "Know your enemy," Reed replied simply. "Isn't that the first chapter in your tactical manual?" "It's certainly chapter 1 in ours." Before Thera could respond, the ship shuddered violently. A deafening explosion somewhere above sent vibrations through the metal around them. The tunnel section ahead collapsed, blocking their path completely. "Back!" Reed shouted, already reversing direction. Move. They scrambled backward as the ceiling began to buckle. Thera's lower right arm caught on a jagged piece of metal, tearing through her scales. Pain lanced up her limb as they tumbled out of the access panel and back into the corridor. Reed was on his feet instantly, weapon drawn, scanning for threats. When he saw her injury, he holstered his pistol and knelt beside her. "Let me see," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "It's nothing," Thera insisted, but the violet blood seeping between her scales suggested otherwise. Reed's face hardened. "Admiral, with all due respect, now is not the time for interspecies pride. You're bleeding, and Vexeri can track Silurian blood from half a system away." He was right, and they both knew it. Reluctantly, Thera extended her injured arm. With surprising gentleness, Reed examined the wound. Clean cut, deep but missed the major vessels. From a pocket, he produced a small medical kit and selected a seal patch. "This might sting," he warned. "Human medical tech, not specifically designed for Silurian physiology." Thera hissed as he applied the patch, but the bleeding stopped almost immediately. The sensation of his fingers against her scales sent an unexpected wave of warmth through her body. Her biological cycle was definitely accelerating. Another complication they didn't need. "We need to find another route to engineering," Reed said, helping her to her feet. "And quickly. The Vexeri will have breaching parties throughout the ship by now." A sudden burst of weapons fire from around the corner confirmed his assessment. 3 Vexeri soldiers in full battle armor turned the corridor, their insectoid forms encased in chitinous exoskeletons augmented by advanced weaponry. Reed shoved Thera behind him and fired in a single fluid motion. His first shot caught the lead Vexeri in what passed for its neck joint, one of the few vulnerable points in their natural armor. The creature collapsed with a high-pitched screech. "The access panel to environmental control," Thera shouted, pointing to a small doorway behind them. "It connects to the secondary systems junction." They backed toward it, Reed providing covering fire, while Thera worked the manual override. As the door finally slid open, a Vexeri energy blast caught Reed in the shoulder, spinning him around with the impact. Thera grabbed him with her uninjured arms and pulled him through the doorway, slamming her palm against the emergency seal control. The door hissed shut, the reinforced metal glowing red as Vexeri weapons fire impacted the other side. It wouldn't hold for long. "Captain." Thera knelt beside Reed, who was clutching his shoulder, his face contorted in pain. "How severe?" "I've had worse," he grunted, though the charred flesh visible through his torn uniform suggested otherwise. "Armor absorbed most of it. Just need a moment." Thera accessed the small medical kit strapped to her belt, selecting a Silurian pain suppressant. "This is designed for my species, but the base compounds are compatible with human physiology. It will help with the pain, though it may cause some disorientation." Reed's eyes met hers, surprisingly clear despite his injury. "Do it." She pressed the injector against his neck, and his body immediately tensed, then relaxed as the medication took effect. "Thank you," he murmured. "That's potent. Can you stand? We need to keep moving." With Thera's assistance, Reed got to his feet. The environmental control room was small, primarily filled with atmospheric regulation equipment. A single console glowed dimly in the corner. "I can use this," Thera said, moving to the terminal. "If I can access the ship's systems, I might be able to trigger the emergency protocols." Reed positioned himself by the door, weapon ready despite his injury. "What kind of protocols are we talking about?" "Silurian vessels have specialized defense mechanisms for Vexeri incursions," Thera explained, her 4 hands working the controls with practiced efficiency. "Our ships can release targeted pheromone compounds that disrupt their neural pathways. The Harmony is a diplomatic vessel, but it should have basic versions of the same technology." Reed raised an eyebrow. "You can gas them." "That's impressively ruthless. Coming from a human, I'll take that as a compliment," Thera replied dryly. Her scales flashed with concentration, as she navigated the ship's systems. The terminal suddenly powered down, plunging them into darkness before the emergency lighting activated. "They've cut central power," Reed observed grimly. "We're running on auxiliaries now." Thera hissed in frustration. "Without main power, I can't access the defense systems. We're going to have to reach engineering manually." She turned to face Reed, assessing his condition. "Can you fight?" He straightened, visibly pushing through the pain. "Always." The door's edge began to glow orange as the Vexari started cutting through. "There's another way out," Thera said, pointing to a maintenance hatch in the ceiling. "It leads to the life support crawl spaces. We can use them to bypass the main corridors." Reed nodded, holstering his weapon. "Ladies first." Despite the dire situation, Thera found herself appreciating his attempt at humor. "I'll never understand the human obsession with gendered courtesy during combat situations." "It's part of our charm," Reed replied, his smile strained but genuine. Thera climbed up first, using her multiple arms to gain purchase on the smooth walls. Once through the hatch, she reached down to help Reed, who was clearly struggling with his injured shoulder. As she pulled him up, another wave of her biological cycle hit her, stronger this time, causing her scales to pulse with bioluminescence. Reed's expression changed as he noticed, but not with the disgust or predatory interest she might have expected from a human. Instead, there was a flash of recognition and concern. "Your cycle," he said quietly as they secured the hatch behind them. "It's intensifying." Thera felt her secondary heart rate increase with embarrassment. "How could you possibly?" "I told you, I served with Solarians before," Reed interrupted gently. "I know the signs. The heightened coloration, the bioluminescence. You're approaching full cycle." Thera wanted to deny it, but her body betrayed her as another wave of hormones flooded her system, causing her scales to flash brilliantly in the dimly lit crawl space. "It's the stress," she admitted reluctantly. "Combat situations can accelerate the process, and evolutionary adaptation to ensure propagation of the species during times of crisis." Reed nodded thoughtfully. "Humans have similar responses, though less visible." They began moving through the cramped space, navigating by the soft glow of emergency strips and, increasingly, by the light of Thera's own scales. "How far to engineering?" Reed asked, his breathing labored from the exertion and his injury. "2 more junctions," Thera replied, trying to focus on the mission and not the growing awareness of the human scent, which her cycle-enhanced senses found disturbingly appealing. "If we can reach the ambassador, we can coordinate with any remaining security personnel for a counterattack." Reed's comm unit crackled suddenly. "Captain Reed," came Torres's voice, clearer now. "If you can hear this, be advised. Engineering has been compromised. We've relocated to Emergency Control Center 3. Vexari forces are concentrating on the bridge and engineering." "Copy that, Ambassador," Reed responded. "Admiral Zax and I are en route." "ETA." He glanced at Thera questioningly. 15 minutes if we hurry," she supplied. 15 minutes, Reed confirmed. "Hold position." They continued in tense silence for several minutes, the only sounds their breathing and the distant rumble of the damaged ship. Thera was acutely aware of Reed behind her, the human's resilience impressing her despite her lifelong prejudice. "Admiral," Reed's voice cut through her thoughts. "There's something you should know." The seriousness in his tone made her pause. "What is it, Captain?" "This attack. It's too well coordinated, too precise. The Vexari knew exactly when to hit us and where our vulnerabilities would be." Thera's scales darkened with suspicion. "You think we have a traitor aboard?" "I think someone wanted these peace talks to fail," Reed confirmed. "Someone with intimate knowledge of both the ship's systems and the diplomatic mission's importance." Before Thera could respond, the ship lurched violently. The crawl space around them groaned as stress fractures appeared in the metal. "Structural integrity failing," announced the ship's computer with eerie calm. "Hull breach imminent in sections 7 through 12. Emergency protocols engage. We're in Section 9, Thera said, a cold dread settling in her secondary digestive system. We need to move. Now. They increased their pace, Reed grimacing with each movement as his injured shoulder brushed against the confines of the crawlspace. Ahead, Thera could see the access point that would lead them to the corridor near Emergency Control Center 3. As they reached it, the ship shuddered again. The crawlspace behind them tore open with a deafening screech of metal, exposing the section to the vacuum of space. Emergency force fields flickered to life, but the sudden decompression created a powerful suction. Reed, closer to the breach, was pulled backward. Thera reacted instinctively, her forearms extending to grab him, and the structural supports simultaneously. Pain lanced through her injured arm as she strained against the pull of space. For one terrifying moment, she thought she would lose her grip on him. Then the emergency force field stabilized, and the suction diminished. They collapsed together against the crawlspace wall, breathing heavily. "That's twice you've saved my life today," Reed said, his face inches from hers. "I'm starting to think your research on human inferiority might be flawed." Despite everything, Thera felt a very un-admiral-like laugh bubble up from her secondary respiratory system. "Perhaps I'll need to publish a retraction." Their eyes met, and something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition that transcended species. In that moment, Thera saw not a human, but simply a fellow soldier, brave, capable, and worthy of respect. The intimacy of the moment was shattered by the distant sound of weapons fire. "We need to keep moving," Reed said, returning to mission focus with admirable discipline. "The ambassador is waiting." They reached the access point and carefully descended into the corridor. It was eerily quiet, with only the emergency lighting functioning. The control center was just ahead, its reinforced door sealed. Reed approached first, signaling their presence through the standard military recognition pattern. After a moment, the door slid open just enough to allow them entry. Inside, Ambassador Torres stood with 3 security officers, all showing signs of combat. One wall displayed ship schematics, highlighting the areas under Vexari control. "Captain, Admiral." Torres greeted them with visible relief. "We were beginning to fear the worst." "The situation?" Reed asked, immediately professional despite his obvious pain. "Not good," Torres admitted. "They've taken the bridge and engineering. Life support is failing in multiple sections. We have maybe an hour before the ship becomes uninhabitable." Thera studied the schematics, her tactical mind working despite her increasingly distracting biological condition. "There's a pattern to their movements," she observed. "They're systematically cutting off escape routes while avoiding direct confrontation with security teams." "They're hurting us," Reed agreed, joining her at the display. "But why? If their goal was assassination, they've had multiple opportunities. Unless it's not about killing us," Thera said slowly, a realization dawning. "It's about capturing us, or more specifically." She turned to Torres. "Capturing you, Ambassador." Torres' expression hardened. "The peace accords. If the Vexari can force me to transmit false terms under duress, they could sabotage the entire alliance without firing a shot at the conference." Reed finished. "It's brilliant, in a twisted way." Thera's military training kicked into high gear. "We need to get you off this ship, Ambassador. Right now." "The escape pods have been disabled," one of the security officers reported grimly. "Not all of them," Thera corrected, pointing to a section of the schematics. "There's a diplomatic emergency pod located near the ambassador's quarters. It's designed for covered evacuation, shielded from standard sensors." Reed looked impressed. "How did you know about that?" "It's not on any official ship layout. I make it my business to know every possible escape route before I board any vessel," Thera replied. "A habit that has served me well over the years." Torres nodded decisively. "Then that's our objective. But the path to my quarters is crawling with Vexari," Reed confirmed, studying the sensor readings. Will need a diversion. Thera's scales pulsed with inspiration. I can provide one. My biological cycle. The pheromones I'm producing are similar to the compounds used in the anti-Vexari defense systems. If I can access an environmental control junction, I could release them manually into specific ship sections. Reed looked concerned. That would require you to separate from the group and expose yourself to potentially dangerous levels of your own hormones. It's a risk I'm willing to take, Thera said firmly. The peace talks must proceed. Too many lives depend on it. A moment of silent communication passed between them. Concern, respect, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. I'll go with the Admiral, Reed announced, turning to Torres. Williams and Chen will escort you to the pod. Ramirez stays here to coordinate and provide updates on Vexari movements. Torres looked between them, a knowing expression crossing her face. Very well, Captain. Good luck to you both. She placed a hand briefly on Reed's uninjured shoulder. Try to avoid any heroic last stands, As they prepared to split up, Reed approached Thera. You realize this plan of yours is exactly the kind of irrational human risk-taking you criticized in your third paper on comparative military strategies. Thera's scales flashed with surprised amusement. You really did read all my work. Know your enemy, remember? Reed replied, but his tone made it clear he no longer considered her such. The environmental control junction was located in a maintenance section 2 decks below. They moved silently through the damaged ship, avoiding Vexari patrols when possible and eliminating them quickly when not. Reed's combat skills impressed Thera. He moved with a fluid efficiency that belied his injury, and his marksmanship was exceptional. For a species she had dismissed as relying on brute force rather than finesse, he demonstrated remarkable tactical precision. By the time they reached the junction, Thera's biological cycle was approaching its peak. Her scales pulsed with vibrant colors, and her thought processes were increasingly fragmented. She fought to maintain focus as she accessed the environmental controls. I can redirect the atmospheric circulation, she explained, her four hands working different controls simultaneously. Channel the pheromones through these sections, creating a clear path for the ambassador, while drawing Vexari forces away from the escape pod. Reed positioned himself at the entrance, keeping watch. How long will it take? 5 minutes to program the sequence, Thera replied, her voice strained. Another 3 for the compounds to reach effective concentration. As she worked, Reed maintained a respectful silence, but she could feel his eyes on her occasionally, watching not with disgust or fascination, but with genuine concern. You're in pain, he observed quietly. Thera didn't deny it. The cycle is not meant to be suppressed. In normal circumstances, I would be in a specialized chamber with regulated atmospheric conditions. She paused, a wave of discomfort washing over her. Among my kind, this is a private matter. I understand, Reed said simply. On Earth, we have similar taboos about biological functions. Different details, same principle. His matter-of-fact acceptance surprised her. No judgment, no awkward human curiosity, just recognition of a shared experience across species. The console beeped as the final sequence engaged. It's done, Thera announced. The ambassador should have a clear path now. We should. The words died in her throat as a wave of dizziness overwhelmed her. Her knees buckled, and she would have collapsed if not for Reed's quick reflexes. He caught her with his good arm, carefully supporting her weight. The concentration, she managed to explain, her scales fluctuating wildly. In this enclosed space, affecting me more than anticipated. Reed's face showed understanding. We need to get you out of here. His comm unit activated. Reed to Torres. Status. Almost at the pod, came the ambassador's reply. Your diversion is working. Vexari forces are redirecting to your position. Understood. Proceed with evacuation. We'll find another way off. Thera tried to protest. Captain, the mission includes getting both of us out alive, Reed interrupted firmly. "Can you walk?" With his support, Thera managed to stand, though her equilibrium was severely compromised. "The maintenance shaft," she directed. "Third panel. It leads to the auxiliary craft bay." They had barely made it halfway down the corridor when the first Vexuri patrol appeared around the corner. Reed reacted instantly, pushing Thera behind him and firing in a single motion. 2 Vexuri dropped, but 3 more took their place. "Go," Reed shouted, continuing to provide covering fire. "I'll hold them off." "Not without you," Thera insisted, drawing her own weapon despite her compromised state. Together, they retreated down the corridor, alternating fire to keep the Vexuri at bay. They reached the maintenance shaft entrance, and Reed pried it open. "You first," he insisted. Thera didn't argue this time, recognizing the tactical sense. She crawled into the narrow passage, Reed close behind. They had barely sealed the entrance when a massive explosion rocked the ship. "Torres to Reed," the ambassador's voice came through, distorted by interference. "We've reached the pod. Launching now. The Vexuri have set charges throughout the ship. You have approximately 7 minutes before catastrophic hull failure." Reed's expression remained determinedly calm. "Copy that. Good luck, Ambassador. Complete the mission." He turned to Thera, managing a smile despite their dire situation. 7 minutes to reach the auxiliary bay, find a functional craft, and launch. Think we can make it. With a human's irrational optimism and a Silurian's superior planning. Thera found herself responding with unexpected humor. "Possibly." They moved as quickly as Thera's condition allowed, navigating the maze of maintenance tunnels. Reed's shoulder wound was clearly worsening, but he never slowed or complained. His resilience was impressive. When they finally reached the auxiliary bay, they found it in chaos. The hull breach had depressurized half the section, emergency force fields barely containing the vacuum. Only 2 small shuttlecraft remained intact. "Can you fly one of these?" Reed asked as they approached the nearest vessel. "Better than you can," Thera replied automatically, her ingrained competitiveness surfacing even now. Reed actually laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that seemed entirely inappropriate for their situation, and yet somehow perfect. "I don't doubt it." The shuttle systems were operational but damaged. As Thera worked to initiate the launch sequence, Reed secured the hatch and checked the small craft's weapon systems. 4 minutes to structural failure, the ship's computer announced with inappropriate serenity. "No pressure," Reed muttered, sliding into the co-pilot's seat. "Just another day at the office." Thera's hands flew across the controls, bypassing safety protocols and overriding automated launch procedures. Her scales pulsed with concentration, her biological discomfort temporarily pushed aside by the focus required for their survival. "The bay doors aren't responding," she announced grimly. "Manual override required." Reed understood immediately. Someone has to stay behind to activate it. Their eyes met, a momentary battle of wills. Both prepared to sacrifice themselves, neither willing to allow the other to do so. "Together or not at all," Thera said firmly. "There's another way." She redirected power to the shuttle's forward weapons. "These craft have minimal armaments, but at close range. They'll punch through the doors," Reed finished, immediately grasping her plan. "Brilliant." The ship shuddered around them, the structural integrity failing faster than predicted. They had maybe 2 minutes now, not 4. "Hang on," Thera warned as she engaged the engines. The shuttle lifted off unsteadily, hovering in the middle of the bay. She targeted the weakest point of the bay doors and fired. The concentrated energy blast tore through the already compromised metal, creating a jagged opening barely larger than the shuttle itself. Emergency force fields attempted to contain the breach, flickering erratically. "That's our cue," Reed said, threading the needle time. With precision that would have impressed her academy instructors, Thera guided the shuttle through the opening, scraping the sides, but making it through intact. The moment they cleared the ship, its remaining systems failed catastrophically. The Harmony broke apart in a series of explosions, the shock wave catching their small craft and sending it tumbling. Thera fought for control, her multiple arms providing an advantage as she manipulated several systems simultaneously. Gradually, the shuttle stabilized. "Ambassador Torres' pod?" she asked, checking the scanners. Reed leaned forward, examining the readings, already picked up by the advanced diplomatic vessel. They made it. Relief flooded through Thera's system, quickly followed by the return of her biological discomfort. Now that the immediate danger had passed, her cycle reasserted itself with full force. Her scales rippled with vivid colors, and she couldn't suppress a groan of discomfort. Reed's expression shifted to concern. "Set course for the nearest Solarian outpost. You need proper medical care." "The peace talks will proceed with Torres," Reed said firmly. "Our part is done, Admiral. We've completed the mission." Thera wanted to argue, but found she lacked the strength. As she programmed the coordinates, another wave of her cycle hit, causing her hands to tremble on the controls. Reed carefully moved her aside, taking over the piloting. "Rest," he said gently. "I may not be as good a pilot as you, but I can follow a programmed course." Too exhausted to maintain her pride, Thera allowed herself to sink into the co-pilot's seat. "Captain Reed." "Marcus." "Thank you." He glanced at her, surprise evident at her use of his first name. "For what?" "For challenging my preconceptions, for saving my life. She hesitated, unaccustomed to such admissions, "for seeing me as an equal, not just an alien curiosity." Reed's expression softened. "I could say the same to you, Thera." The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her system. They sat in companionable silence as the shuttle traveled toward the Solarian outpost, both contemplating how much had changed in such a short time. 3 weeks later, Admiral Thera Zak stood before a new class of cadets at the Solarian Military Academy. Her scales had returned to their normal professional blue-green, her cycle having passed without incident under proper medical care. "Humans," she began, watching the young Solarians lean forward expectantly, "are perhaps the most contradictory species in the known galaxy." She paced the length of the platform, all 4 arms relaxed at her sides. "They are impulsive yet calculating, emotional yet logical, fragile yet remarkably resilient. And contrary to what you may have heard," she paused, meeting the eyes of several cadets who had attended her previous lectures, "they are capable of extraordinary restraint, adaptability, and respect for cultural differences." A murmur of surprise ran through the audience. This was not the lecture they had expected from the notoriously human skeptic Admiral Zax. "The peace accords between the Galactic Council and the Vexari Collective were successfully negotiated last week," she continued. "A diplomatic achievement that many believed impossible, made reality through cooperation between our species and humans." As she continued her lecture, the door at the back of the amphitheater opened quietly. Captain Marcus Reed slipped in, standing at the rear of the hall. Even at a distance, Thera's enhanced eyesight could see the smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he listened. "In conclusion," Thera said, drawing her lecture to a close, "prepare yourselves not just for conflict with other species, but for cooperation. The future of our place in the galaxy may well depend not on our ability to fight, but on our willingness to understand." As the cadets filed out, Reed approached the podium. "Quite a different message from the last time I heard you lecture," he observed with gentle teasing. "The cadets looked positively confused by your lack of anti-human rhetoric." Thera's scales rippled with amusement. "Evolution is the mark of an intelligent species, Captain. We adapt based on new information." "And what new information informed this particular evolution?" he asked, his eyes holding hers with that same intensity she had first noticed aboard the Harmony. "Field research," she replied, a rare smile forming. "Very hands-on field research." Reed laughed, the sound still as welcome to her ears as it had been during their escape. "Speaking of research, I've been assigned as military liaison to the Solarian High Command for the next standard year. Apparently, someone recommended me specifically for the position. Thera's scales flushed slightly. The High Command values competence, and I hear the Admiral in charge of the Cross-Species Initiative is quite demanding. Reed continued, his expression playful. Something about requiring first-hand knowledge of Solarian culture and biology. Is that rumor concerning to you, Captain? Thera asked, gathering her data crystals from the podium. Reed's smile widened. On the contrary, Admiral, I've always valued a thorough education, particularly when it challenges established perspectives. As they walked together toward the exit, their shoulders almost touching, Thera reflected on how completely her universe had shifted in mere weeks. The feared concept of working alongside a human had transformed into something she now anticipated with surprising eagerness. I've updated my research papers, she told him as they left the amphitheater. Submitted new findings on human-Solarian cooperation potential. And what conclusion did you reach? Reed asked. Thera's scales rippled with a pattern that, among her species, indicated contentment and anticipation, a combination she would have once considered impossible in the presence of a human. That further study is required, she replied. Extensive long-term study. Reed's answering smile told her he understood perfectly what she was really saying. I look forward to contributing to your research, Admiral. As they walked into the Solarian sunset, two representatives of species that had once seemed incompatible, Thera realized that sometimes the most important discoveries came from challenging one's most deeply held beliefs, and sometimes the best partnerships formed where you least expected them.